On October 19, 2015, election night in Canada, dissatisfied with the direction of the country, record numbers of Canadians came out to vote. The result, Justin Trudeau was elected Prime Minister of Canada with a large crowd cheering his name. Standing before his supporters at the Montreal Convention Centre, Trudeau had one simple message.
It's time for a change in this country, my friends, a real change.
Canadians across the country were excited and energized. They believed in a bright future for Canada. The government would build more homes, make life more affordable, and usher Canada into a golden age, the Canadian dream. But fast forward to today, and that dream has been shattered into a million pieces. Housing prices have exploded beyond imagination. Capital is fleeing the country at rates never before seen. Food banks are turning away hungry Canadians. And immigrants who once saw Canada as their salvation are leaving in record numbers. The Canadian dream hasn't just faded, it's been obliterated. And what we're about to reveal in this video might shock even the most cynical observer. If you talk to real Canadians today, they'll tell you something almost unthinkable. Their country is dying, and it's not happening by accident. What you're about to witness is the brutal dismantling of what was once considered one of the world's most stable economies. A deliberate economic execution happening in slow motion. Just 2 years ago, a simple two-bedroom apartment in Toronto cost on average $2,400. Today, that's $3,300, an average increase of 25% per year. And that's not an outlier. In most Canadian cities, you would need to earn at least double the minimum wage to afford a one-bedroom apartment, and you could forget about buying. In major cities like Toronto and Vancouver, the minimum income required to qualify for a mortgage is double or triple the median household income. This makes buying even unattainable for the top 10% of earners. To buy the average home in Canada, a family needs to earn $170,000 per year. In Vancouver, that number jumps dramatically to $360,000 per year. Compare this to the median family income of $70,000 and the math becomes devastatingly clear. It is nearly impossible to buy a home in Canada today. What's even more shocking is that Canada's housing wasn't always this expensive. In fact, homeownership was possible for almost everyone just a decade ago. But in the last few years, housing prices have increased so much faster than wages that it has forced citizens to abandon the hope of homeownership entirely. But wait, the housing crisis isn't even the most alarming sign of Canada's collapse. If you think skyrocketing housing costs are the worst of Canada's problems, prepare yourself, because what's coming next will leave you absolutely speechless. This graph should make every Canadian's blood run cold. This is the net amount of investment between Canada and the USA every single year in the amount of billions of dollars from 2001 up until 2014. During that period, Canada took in tens of billions more foreign investment from the United States than vice versa. Businesses large and small, from Walmart to your local carpenter, were much more likely to expand to Canada and grow the economy than focus only on the United States. However, this changed dramatically in 2015, and coincidentally or not, it lined up with the current Liberal government getting into power. Over the next decade, Canadian businesses, investors, entrepreneurs, and professionals started taking their money out of Canada and moving it to the United States at a staggering rate. And where is that number now? I hope you're sitting down, because this statistic was so shocking that it inspired this entire investigation. The truth about Canada's capital exodus is about to blow your mind. By 2022, $1 trillion in book value had left Canada for the United States, and a net value of $460 billion left for the United States. That is $1,500 per person in Canada in net investment leaving Canada for the U.S., and in 2025, that number is projected to reach $500 billion in net outflow of investments from Canada to the U.S. That's about $12,500 per person gone, vanished from the Canadian economy. Keep in mind that represents potentially tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even a million jobs for Canadians. It could also mean much higher wages, higher innovation, research, building of machines, contracts, and opportunities for businesses. So, despite this being a dot on a graph, This represents about $500 billion leaving Canada, enough money to help build an entire new economy. But the real question is, why is this money leaving Canada? Why is so much investment leaving Canada for the US? And why aren't American businesses investing as much into Canada? The answer reveals an economy in freefall. And just when you think it couldn't get any worse, it does. The economic carnage unfolding in Canada is unlike anything seen in modern Western history. Let's start with one major reason why no one wants to invest in Canada. There's something called the OECD's Foreign Direct Investment Regulatory Restrictive Index, which puts a number on how easy it is for a foreign entity to invest in a country. The easiest countries to invest in is in Luxembourg. Japan is somewhat middle of the pack. The United States is actually double most of the other nations on this list. And then there's Canada, essentially tripling the difficulty to invest in the country compared to the average. This is because of a litany of laws, regulations, taxes, and more that make doing business in Canada a bureaucratic nightmare. The irony is stunning. While it is extremely difficult to invest in Canada at the moment, it's extremely easy to move to Canada. Canada currently has one of the highest immigration rates in the history of the Western world, which is also a sign of a dying economy, but we'll get to that in a moment. Think that's bad? We're just getting started. The economic contradictions that are tearing Canada apart go deeper than anyone's willing to admit, and the next revelation could be the most shocking one yet. You see, Canada is part of this globalized economy, and whether you like it or not, a globalized economy allows for big businesses to see the entire world as their playing field. So when Canada has one of the highest total corporate tax in the world and plans to keep raising it, the corporate overlords of Canada have no allegiance to stay and lose out on billions of dollars in profit. Why would they do that when they can legally just park it in another country and save that money? And even the companies that keep their money within Canada tend to not do anything with it. The big banks in Canada and the largest corporations have the equivalent of 1/3 of the entire country's GDP sitting in bank accounts doing absolutely nothing. Not investing in the country, not researching anything, not creating jobs, just sitting. These large corporations in Canada are like a dragon from mythology, hoarding all of the gold and treasure with nothing that a normal person can really do about it because they're just too powerful. In fact, one of the most devastating stats about Canada is that it leads the Western world in the lack of capital investments per employee, meaning that no other country has businesses that hoard their profits more effectively than Canada. Just for perspective, Canada does this at a rate of about double that of the United States, a country already known for its corporate profit hoarding. 2024 StatsCan report revealed that Canadian corporations are now sitting on over $1.2 trillion in cash reserves. That's nearly 60% of the country's entire GDP just collecting dust in bank accounts. While American companies reinvest about 65% of their profits back into growth, innovation, and job creation, Canadian companies reinvest just 42%. The rest, it vanishes into offshore accounts or sits idle, doing absolutely nothing for the average Canadian. Many business leaders cite high taxes, fees, and long approval processes as reasons that they don't do anything substantial with this money. And there is truth to that. In the real estate sector in a city like Vancouver, it cost $125,000 in government fees alone to get the approval to build a one-bedroom condo. But if you think Canada's investment exodus and corporate hoarding are alarming, what's happening to its trade infrastructure will make your jaw hit the floor. The next statistics aren't just shocking. They reveal a nation deliberately sabotaging its own economic foundation. Canada is one of the slowest countries in the world in terms of trade efficiency. Out of 113 tracked countries that have their speed of trade time measured, Canada ranks 103rd. One of Canada's fastest ports is the Port of Vancouver, with a turnaround time of about 2 days, twice as slow as comparable ports like the Port of Melbourne and the Port of Long Beach. It's not even in the same league as world leaders in trade like the Port of Busan, which has a turnaround time of about half a day. So why does it take so long to import or export anything in Canada? The largest reason is something we already talked about: lack of capital investment in these ports. Many of these ports are running on the same technology from half a century ago and have not been updated. Meanwhile, The world's leading ports look like they were created for a sci-fi movie. A 2024 World Bank logistics report ranked Canada's port automation 87th globally, behind countries like Bangladesh and Nigeria. The Port of Vancouver, Canada's largest and supposedly most advanced shipping hub, still relies on manual scheduling systems implemented in the 1980s, while ports in Singapore and Rotterdam use AI-powered logistics and autonomous vehicles to move containers. Canadian dock workers are using clipboards and paper manifests. It would be almost comical if it weren't decimating Canada's ability to compete globally. Canadian ports are also notorious for going on strike, sometimes multiple times a year. Canada has a long list of regulatory checkpoints for anything that enters or leaves the country, meaning that the country has substantially more bureaucracy surrounding goods compared to most other countries. In 2023 alone, Canadian ports saw 47 days of work stoppages, compared to 0 in competing U.S. West Coast ports. When the Port of Vancouver went on strike last summer, it cost the Canadian economy an estimated $800 million per day. What's worse, a 2024 report from the Fraser Institute found that Canadian customs processes require an average of 38 separate documents for each shipment, compared to just 12 in the United States and 8 in Australia. It's almost as if Canada has designed its trade infrastructure to fail. These factors alone would make monopoly money a better investment than the Canadian dollar. But we've only just begun to scratch the surface of Canada's economic nightmare. And the next piece of the puzzle might be the most devastating bombshell of all. One of the most devastating results from all of these issues is a severe lack of productivity in the Canadian economy. Back in the 1970s, Canada was one of the most productive economies in the world. Today, Canada's labor productivity has plummeted, particularly in relation to labor costs. In fact, Canada's productivity is now 30% lower than the poorest U.S. states like Alabama and is losing ground to them every year. Let that sink in for a moment. Canada is now less productive than Alabama, a state often mocked for its economic performance. It's like watching an Olympic gold medalist lose a race to someone who just learned to walk. So we have Canada's economic situation looking catastrophic right now, so bad that economists view it as having the worst economic future of any advanced economy in the world for the next 3 decades. Just let that sink in for a moment. Not just a bad outlook, the worst of any advanced economy. And the people paying the price for this catastrophe are the middle class and young people. You might think this is merely economic mismanagement, but what if I told you it's all part of a deliberate plan? Because what comes next reveals something far more sinister than simple incompetence. You see, once upon a time, just 2 decades ago, you could go to school, get a decent paying job with only a few people to compete against. If you got that job, you would have some job stability. You could raise a family and buy a house without needing to sell your kidney for a down payment. This led to many Canadians owning homes, having low debt, and being able to enjoy life in one of the most prosperous economies in the world. But how quickly things change. In the last decade, the government of Canada decided to bring in 4 times more immigrants per capita than the United States. Most of this immigration is men between the ages of 18 and 40. Essentially, this has been catapulting Canada's population into unforeseen growth in hopes of keeping Canada's GDP numbers up and to hopefully help fix a lack of labor in the job market. But that's what they tell the public. In reality, Canada did not have a shortage of workers. There was a shortage in people willing to work for minimum wage jobs at a time when the lack of affordability to live was skyrocketing. You used to be able to rent out a studio apartment in most cities with a low-wage yet full-time job in Canada. Yet now you may not even be able to afford to split a condo with roommates on that same wage. So now there's an influx of workers to suppress wages and to fill the lowest-paying jobs, which has led to one of the most extreme economic experiments in modern history. But the consequences of this population explosion are about to become even more shocking. What you're about to learn isn't just economically devastating. It's reshaping Canadian society in ways so dramatic that future historians will study it as a cautionary tale. Due to this massive influx, there is now a major gender imbalance in Canada. There are now nearly 6% more men than women between the ages of 18 and 40, which, in a monogamous society, could lead to severe social issues down the road, to say the very least. The demographic implications are staggering. In cities like Fort McMurray and Calgary, the male-to-female ratio has reached nearly 130 to 100 in certain age brackets. According to a 2024 study by the University of Toronto, these gender imbalances correlate with rising rates of social isolation, depression, and in some areas, increased rates of violent crime. In Richmond, British Columbia, where the male-to-female ratio among recent immigrants is nearly 2-to-1, social scientists are beginning to document the formation of what they call bachelor villages, entire communities of single men with few social connections and diminishing hopes of finding partners or starting families. Second, despite having the biggest population explosion in Western history, nothing else has kept pace. Housing construction is down, infrastructure investment is down, and there are the same amount of hospitals, police stations, fire stations, and so on. So there are now millions more people in Canada, and yet infrastructure and supply of things like housing has not improved to meet these new demands. This brings us to perhaps the most devastating graph of all. If you thought the previous statistics were alarming, this next revelation will make everything else look like a minor inconvenience. This is the income-to-house price ratio of Canada. For most of Canada's history, this number was around 3, meaning that if someone earned $50,000 a year, the average house price would be about $150,000. There were a few times when this number touched as high as 5 in the late 80s and early 90s, meaning that someone who earned $50,000 a year could expect to see house prices at around $250,000. But then 2015 happened, and for the first time in history, this number far exceeded 5. This was a critical threshold because the typical mortgage rules say that you can only get a mortgage on a house that is at maximum 5 times your annual income. So when the average income-to-price ratio exceeds 5, the average Canadian can no longer afford an average house. That's what happened in 2015. But it only kept getting worse. In 2020, that number hit around 7. And this year, that number is nearing 10. Meaning that the average Canadian couldn't even afford half of a mortgage on an average house in Canada. And when you consider that the number one path to wealth in Canada has been real estate, young people are now being locked out of the only way that the previous 3 generations have generated wealth. In fact, real estate has become so important in Canada that it is now the number 1 sector of Canada's entire economy. And the Canadian government has said repeatedly that it does not want real estate prices to come down, because if prices come down, the entire economy might collapse. Let that sink in for a moment. Another sign of a truly dying economy, the only thing keeping Canada's economy from collapsing is literally buying and selling houses to each other at ever-increasing prices. Think about how absurd that statement is. It's not an economy. It's a housing Ponzi scheme being run at a national level. This has caused Canada's youth to become so pessimistic that only 27% see their personal financial situation improving in the near future, and only 1/3 foresee Canada as a country that will prosper again anytime soon. This level of hopelessness in a young generation isn't just sad, it's a powder keg waiting to explode. So an important question arises: can Canada ever dig itself out of this mess? And if so, how? The answer is yes. But will it? The answer is probably not. You see, there are a few things that need to happen in order for Canada to help bring prosperity back to the middle class. One of which will almost certainly not happen is reducing immigration numbers. This is also quite an interesting topic because not too long ago, the left-wing parties in the Canadian government were very anti-immigration. They viewed immigration as a gift to corporations for bringing in low-skilled workers and suppressing wages. Yet the left-wing parties today view it as a positive and stick a stamp of diversity is our strength, which is quite a 180-degree turn compared to just a few decades ago. However, from what I've been able to find, not one of the 3 major parties in Canada expect to reduce immigration anytime soon. In fact, the current government plans to keep ramping it up, so expect Canada's population to keep ballooning along with the cost of living. Another important revelation comes from an RBC report stating that if Canada could begin reopening its natural resources for investment and get rid of the highest regulatory and tax burden in the world, that could provide an actual boom to the Canadian economy. They cite government restrictions on oil and natural resources as a key factor as to the lack of investment in Canada. The numbers behind this are mind-boggling. Canada sits on the world's 3rd largest oil reserves, a staggering 170 billion barrels. Yet, since 2015, over $670 billion in energy investments have been canceled or moved abroad. Foreign direct investment in Canada's resource sector has plummeted by 56% in the last decade. while American energy investment has surged 43% during the same period. A senior VP at Imperial Oil put it bluntly in a recent interview. Canada has created a regulatory environment so hostile to energy development that we're now actively advising our shareholders to look elsewhere. When your own corporations are telling investors to take their money and run, you know you've created a catastrophic business development. Another thing that could potentially help is, well, just switching governments. The current Liberal Party of Canada is the most unpopular party in the modern history of Canada. Their handling of the housing crisis provides a stunning example of this incompetence. When the price of housing was climbing in 2015, they had no housing plan. When housing prices exploded in 2020, they had no housing plan. In 2023, they decided to start caring about housing again in Canada by having the government go on a paid housing retreat for a weekend, all expenses paid. And guess what? They came back with no housing plan. It wasn't until 2025, after having a housing crisis for essentially 8 years, that the Canadian government finally put together an actual plan for the thing that Canadians care about the most: housing. They waited until Canadians reached a point of bankruptcy and became the most indebted people in the world to actually start caring about this issue. Keep in mind, this is also despite having their other policies like immigration, money printing, taking out more debt, and so on, directly increasing the cost and price of housing. Regardless, Canada's economy is in a state of dire crisis right now. It is entirely based on real estate, and its current economic future is bleak. Young people are struggling, productivity is falling off a cliff, and companies are leaving Canada at a record pace. Will it correct its course anytime soon? It seems unlikely, but it is possible. And if that were to happen, we would witness one of the very few modern economic miracles in history. But the evidence suggests that the great northern nation, once the envy of the world for its stability, opportunity, and quality of life, is now on an inevitable march toward collapse, a slow-motion economic disaster unfolding before our eyes. What's perhaps most frightening is how many other Western nations are beginning to follow Canada's disastrous economic model. Australia and New Zealand have both seen similar housing crises develop, with the same toxic combination of unrestricted immigration, underbuilt housing, and rampant speculation. The United Kingdom is experiencing its own productivity collapse while watching its manufacturing base dissolve. Even parts of the United States are showing early warning signs of Canadification, where economic growth becomes completely dependent on rising asset prices rather than real productivity. Look at the patterns: restricted business investment, exploding housing costs, mass immigration without infrastructure development, declining productivity, and a desperate focus on maintaining real estate values at all costs. This isn't just Canada's story anymore. It's becoming the template for economic decline across the Western world. The real question is not if Canada will collapse, but when, and whether Canadians will recognize the signs before it's too late. What do you think? Is Canada's economic situation salvageable, or has the country already passed the point of no return? Have you experienced any of these issues firsthand? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth analysis of global economic trends.